This is the Depth Mystic Community Podcast, episode 19. This week, I'm going to ask Jungian Depth Mystic the question of why it's been so difficult for him to find anything in society that he can readily join and build a career out of. So let's bring him on, Jungian Depth Mystic Zach Tolan. Well, hi, podcast host Zach Tolan. What's going on? Oh, nothing much. Just doing the weekly podcast. Let's get to the question if we can, because I think it's pretty interesting. And I think you might have an answer to the question of why it's been so hard for you to hook into society. So why has it been so hard for you to hook into society? Well, I think it's because I have a fundamentally different idea of the nature of reality and the world that we live in from most of the people who run the institutions that I might join. You have a fundamental difference in your understanding of reality. That's interesting. I can see how that might make it hard for you to join things, but maybe you can explain a little more about what you mean by that fundamental difference. Well, I think I might have been developing my own idea of reality for a few years, but I sort of kept it to myself because I had no example outside of me of anyone else who believed what I believed. But then I discovered Joseph Campbell, and I believe he qualifies as a depth mystic. He might not have referred to himself as a mystic, but in my world, he qualifies. And when I saw him, I saw somebody who actually embodied what I sort of always believed inwardly, but didn't know it was even possible to exist in this world as somebody who believed that thing. And then, to my dismay, I realized that very few other people hold that same belief structure, so that when they encounter Joseph Campbell, they don't have the same level of enthusiasm that I had when I encountered him. Aha, I see. So, how would you describe this difference in core perspective on reality that you seem to have, and that you claim to share with Joseph Campbell, but that very few other people have? Well, I recently came up with this term that I think might describe, if not my specific worldview, at least the phenomenon of having a worldview that's different from other people's. And I call it metaphysical divergence. As you might know, metaphysics is the branch of philosophy that has to do with basic perspective on the nature of reality. Now, if somebody diverges in the realm of metaphysics, then it means that at the most core level, the foundation of all other thoughts, they believe something different about the world they're living in than the people they're dealing with. And that's what I found in Joseph Campbell. And it's kind of like a splinter or a crack in the harmony that would otherwise be present in the process for me of joining anything else that goes on in society. Take Carl Jung, for example. He had his own worldview, which he thought of as personality number 2. He had 2 personalities. And personality number 1 was suitable for belonging in society, finding a way to integrate into society. But personality number 2 was what I'm calling metaphysically divergent from normal society and didn't have a normal way of fitting in. And Carl Jung threaded the needle. He discovered a successful way of integrating into society without simultaneously abandoning entirely the needs of his personality number two. And Jung's solution was to go into the field of psychiatry. So on the one hand, he's a medical doctor who studies the physiological nature of the psyche as a psychiatrist. But on the other hand, in his time, psychiatry was so new that there was still room for daring new theories that actually included the needs of a more comprehensive and you might say religious personality that was his personality number two. And I bring him up because he's a rare case of a totally successful example of somebody who bridged his metaphysical divergence with society successfully. And he did it by becoming a psychiatrist. And then when he needed to say things about the metaphysics, when he needed to actually take a stand and stand up for his worldview itself, the view of personality number two, he was already in good shape as a respected psychiatrist. And so it was a perfect solution. Are you saying that the reason you need to point out Carl Jung's life and his solution is to emphasize how hard the problem of bridging a metaphysical divergence with society actually is? Yes, that's why I brought up Carl Jung, because I wanted to emphasize how hard it is to be someone who sees the world in a fundamentally different way and still integrate successfully with society. And Jung stands out as a premier example of somebody who actually was successful at it. But I do not claim to be anywhere near as successful as he was. Let me put it this way. Carl Jung had a career as a famous and successful psychiatrist, whereas all I have right now is that I get to be the guest on a tiny little podcast that's devoted to the subject matter that I care about. I kind of like your phrase, metaphysical divergence. It sounds pretty cool just to say it. And then when I stop and think about what you're actually talking about, and I remember that metaphysics is a philosophical term, which talks about basic ideas of reality. It's the beginning, as it were, of any philosophical system, talking about what kind of world is it to begin with. And then I'm thinking, well, divergence, I guess that means you have a group and then you have an individual who manifests something different from the group. So that makes perfect sense in the context of this basic question of like why you always had such a hard time finding anything in society that you could fit into. Yeah, and also I wanted to point out something that goes to the question of freedom of religion. Perhaps the best way to describe any given metaphysical perspective on reality is that it is a religion. Like, what is your basic idea of the nature of the world you're in? We could call it a philosophy, but we could also call it a religion. What is your religion? And I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about all the different times and places when people have had a metaphysical divergence. And I was wondering, to what extent have such divergences been accepted in all the various times and places? And then it occurred to me that I happen to live in a country where the right to have a metaphysical divergence is actually written into the very establishing documents of the nation. And that was quite a thought. Because it would seem that the founding fathers of America were highly aware of the possibility of people having metaphysical divergences from each other. And they cared so much about individual people's rights to have whatever religion that they had that they wrote into the founding document said rights. which is pretty profound because I think a lot of societies historically have been reliant on making sure that all the people believe the same thing, that people share the same metaphysics. I mean, almost any successful religion that we know survives by having a community of people who believe it strongly. And a lot of religions are more concerned with conformity within the community than they are with articulating the subtleties of their actual philosophy. So it does seem pretty bold that in America, you're allowed to have any fundamental philosophy you want, and there's a culture and tradition that acknowledges this. So it's important to point that out, especially compared to the Middle Ages, which were obsessed with religion probably more than any other group of people throughout history, in terms of having the one true God and making sure that everybody worships the right God. Everybody obeys and agrees with the correct metaphysics was the essential obsession of the Middle Ages. And that is obviously what the American founding fathers were responding to, was this obsession, which had led to many wars and many burnings at the stake and such things. Okay, well, let's get back to your own metaphysical divergence. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about what exactly your divergence was with the rest of society. Yeah, okay. Well, again, I've come up with a name for my divergence, which I call depth mysticism, which is essentially depth psychology, but without any pretense of scientific credentials. It's just embracing the belief system as if it's a religion that is trying to form a community, as opposed to a professional service, such as psychotherapy, which has its place, but is not raised to the level of a metaphysical point of view. If you market your psychology as a religion, you have to just call it a religion, because the psychological community will feel like you are a heretic. You are getting too far away from their professional confinements. So anyway, I called it depth mysticism, but it's the basic roots that I can find for it can be found maybe starting with Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, but also in the American Ralph Waldo Emerson. And of course, a century later in the psychology of Carl Jung. Okay, but what is this metaphysical divergence? Is there any way to encapsulate it succinctly? Well, I think we've talked about this in previous episodes. The significance of this divergence is so broad that I've talked about the Christian eon and the idea that to really gain an understanding of this new perspective on reality, you'd have to entertain coming to the end of the Christian era and wondering what is going to succeed it. And as Carl Jung has pointed out, the only readily available system for describing what would succeed Christianity in terms of metaphysical divergences from it is the astrological perspective, which talks about the age of Aquarius. So you're bringing in astrology and the age of Aquarius and Christianity and all that. That's pretty big stuff you're trying to talk about, and it doesn't even give me that many specific answers as to what your perspective actually is. Well, yeah, so I bring it up because I'm trying to set the expectation, give a basic idea of just how broad and all-encompassing this differing metaphysics actually is. And I already had it before I encountered Joseph Campbell. And presumably a lot of people have it in one way or another. But not everybody finds their way to acknowledging the full-scale implications that I'm acknowledging right now. And one of the main things in this worldview is that you really ought to include everything in your perspective. You need to integrate everything that exists in your perspective. One thing Christianity does is it banishes the devil. It says, oh, the devil, we don't want to deal with him. We kick out the devil. He's cursed to slither on the earth. All manner of ways of saying that the devil is bad. But I think that era is coming to an end when you basically have to acknowledge everything. And if you're going to reject something, then you're not living up to my standards of how you should live. But of course, that ethics of how you should live is derived from whatever metaphysics I have, which I admit I haven't necessarily done a great job of describing that core difference. What is the core thing that made me love Joseph Campbell and know that Joseph Campbell was speaking from my worldview when I saw him? And why do so few other people just get really excited about Joseph Campbell? When I saw Joseph Campbell, it seemed natural to me that everyone should get excited about what he was saying. And admittedly, a lot of people have gotten excited about it, just not enough for me to find anything I could hook into in society. When I saw Joseph Campbell, I wanted there to be the college that I could apply to that had devoted itself towards knowing and understanding what Joseph Campbell said. I couldn't find it. There was a few graduate schools, but I didn't even have an undergraduate degree. And so there just wasn't enough of a community devoted to this subject matter. But again, how would I describe what it was? I think there's definitely a kind of scientific anthropology that studies human beings in a scientific way. It's asking, what is a human being? And it's trying to use the general apparatus of science to discover the answer. But unlike certain other kinds of scientific approaches, the Jungian or Joseph Campbell approach doesn't reduce human beings to a simple thing that can just be studied like a rat in a maze. It involves studying mythology and looking at all different stories that people throughout history have told, especially stories that people who aren't from our cultures have told. And I just love that approach. I love the anthropological approach to understanding what people are. And then in Carl Jung's world, recognizing that dreams have remained a mysterious thing and that you can get information about human nature from dreams, that they're readily available to look at dreams and to learn things about human nature from them. So I don't know if I know how to put it in a concise way, what the core nature of this metaphysical divergence is. But it's certainly why I've not found any structure in society that I can belong to. Because when you diverge at the metaphysical level, then you feel a disorientation at all other levels. So if I wanted to have a normal career and, make good money at a thing, I would have to feel comfortable with what I was doing. I would have to feel like I'm actually serving humanity and I'm part of something that makes sense according to the way I see the world. And if you have a metaphysical divergence, that means the basic way you see the world is different from other people. So the way in which any given job might make sense according to your worldview is not going to be the same. And it might not make sense according to your worldview. Are you saying that all the stuff people do in society might not even make sense according to your worldview? Yeah, that's the problem with the metaphysical divergence. Even the most basic things that people do the reasons that they're doing it and the stories they tell themselves about why it's okay and how it all makes sense might not actually make sense if you had a different fundamental worldview. So it's much harder to get started in a situation like this. I can imagine. It sounds a lot like The Matrix. Like, how different is it for the characters in The Matrix to go back into The Matrix after they've seen the real world and play along with the people who haven't seen the real world? The same question was asked by Plato thousands of years earlier, but the point is, the way you're talking about it evokes The Matrix. And so I can definitely understand why you would have such trouble feeling comfortable just going through normal pathways and getting normal jobs. Yes, and it's also heartbreakingly disappointing that this is the case. You know, we do have a myth in society, the myth of the fall of man from the Garden of Eden, which is the starting story of the most famous religion in our culture. And it also starts with a heartbreakingly disappointing story. And so there is a parallel there, I guess. Wait, so you're saying that you can imagine societies that don't have a parallel to the fall of man? Are you saying that you're thinking of societies that don't have such a heartbreak? Yeah. I mean, I'm not saying the fall of man isn't true or that this huge divergence in perspective and understanding of reality isn't actually the case. I'm not saying that we don't have to deal with it as such, but I can't imagine a society that never had such a massive rupture in its core understanding of the nature of the universe. And therefore it didn't have nearly as many problems to solve when it came to patching up the rupture. For example, Joseph Campbell says that Japan is a culture in which the fall of man never actually occurred. And if you look at Japanese culture, that's a believable statement. Because Japanese art does kind of evoke a possibility of never having experienced the fall of man to begin with. And so it's important to think about that, to realize that your story of the fall of man, your story of the fundamental brokenness of society doesn't necessarily have to be true. And it might be possible for us to build a society in which there isn't such a fundamental brokenness. Okay, Jungian depth mystic Zach Tolan. That's good enough for this week. Thanks for joining me again. You can hop on our Discord or our Facebook group and leave a comment if you want. And until we have a more interesting parting catchphrase, I will see you next week.